So, for those of you who watched the last video, you're probably very familiar with this picture because it is the picture I use to discuss how a package of food, or what is called a bolus, is swallowed. And the reason I'm talking about that is because I want to refresh your memory as we move forward, because today we're going to be talking about the stomach. And the stomach is attached to the esophagus, and the esophagus is the tube that passes food from the oral cavity or the mouth. So we have this swallowing procedure where the bolus is formed by the tongue pushes against the hard palate, and then kind of wave motions itself up against the soft palate to push that bolus of food to the pharynx, coming in contact with the uvula that drops the epiglottis into place over the esophagus and allows the food to pass into the esophagus. I'm sorry, I said the epiglottis passes over the esophagus. It passes over the trachea and the food passes into the esophagus. So, stomach. The esophagus comes down here and we have those wave-like contractions pushing that food down. Now, the stomach actually begins at a sphincter called the cardioesophageal sphincter. Then you have the first section of the stomach, which is called the cardia. Then you have the little uptick of the stomach that kind of curves up next to the esophagus, which is the fundus. Then you have the main part of the stomach, which is called the body. And then you have the last section of the stomach called the pylorus. And the pylorus ends with the pyloric sphincter. After the pyloric sphincter, we actually move into the small intestine, beginning with the duodenum. So let's talk a little bit more about the stomach. So, cardioesophageal sphincter, like I said, that's the very beginning of the stomach. A sphincter is a circular muscle. Your iris is a sphincter. You also have sphincters all throughout your alimentary canal, ending, of course, with the most famous of sphincters, the anus. So we've already talked about the sections of the stomach on the last slide. Let's talk a little bit about the other structures of the stomach. First, the stomach looks like a backward C. It has the lesser curvature on the inside of the C and the greater curvature on the outside of the C. The stomach is made up of 3 layers of muscle that is all surrounded by a membrane. That membrane is called the serosa. Inside the serosa, of course, you have these 3 layers of muscle. The topmost layer, or the outermost layer, is called the longitudinal. And I don't like this picture because it kind of cuts into the fibers. But what happens is these muscle fibers run up and then down the length of the stomach. Then you have the circular layer, which runs in circles. The fibers run in circles, kind of like rubber bands around the stomach. And then you have oblique, where the muscle fibers run at an angle. Then, once you move inside the stomach, what you see are all these little folds. And those folds are called rugae. And the rugae hold all the mucosa cells that produce the mucus that protect the stomach from the acids and the enzymes that make it up. So, functions of the stomach. The stomach is there to mix saliva, which remember is enzymes and mucus, food, and gastric juices, to form a substance called chyme. As soon as food enters the stomach and starts mixing with gastric juices, it is no longer called food. It becomes this substance called chyme. Not chyme, chyme. The gastric juices that it secretes are hydrochloric acid, pepsin, something called intrinsic factor, and lipase. And of course, it holds on to the food until it is ready to be released into the small intestine. So let's look a little bit about these cells that are making these gastric juices. So all along these folds, called rugae, you have what are called gastric pits. And these are tiny little pores that are lined with cells that are producing these different gastric juices. The two that I'm worried about you knowing are chief cells and the parietal cells. You might be familiar with parietal cells because they're called goblet cells, if you remember that from our tissue unit. So here we have our chief cells, and our chief cells are making a substance called pepsinogen. Our parietal cells are making hydrochloric acid. When those two mix, hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen, when those two substances come together, they make a third substance called pepsin. And pepsin is the really big gastric juice that most of your stomach is using. And that is where Pepto-Bismol gets its name, because what it does is Pepto-Bismol shuts down the production of pepsinogen and hydrochloric acid, preventing the construction of pepsin inside your stomach, thereby cutting down the amount of acid overall in your stomach. Which comes in handy if you suffer from one of these first two diseases, acid reflux or GERD. And GERD is just a more severe form of acid reflux. Acid reflux, you might be familiar with by the term of heartburn. This is where the gastric juices actually leave the stomach and continue up into the esophagus. And the problem with that is the esophagus doesn't have a lot of mucosa, so it doesn't have a lot of mucus protecting it from these acid and enzyme mixtures that your stomach makes. So it can actually burn and put holes inside of your esophagus, which is extremely problematic because it can cause infection. GERD, being more severe than regular acid reflux, happens even when food has not been consumed. Acid reflux is really only a reaction from your body consuming food. So oftentimes what you'll see is an overproduction of acid that spills up into the stomach, spills up out of the stomach, And GERD is a more severe form because what happens, what is going on? GERD is a more severe form because it happens even when no food has been consumed. Gastritis is an infection in the mucosa lining of the stomach, and it is closely tied to peptic ulcers. Peptic ulcers used to be thought to be caused by stress. What we now know is that peptic ulcers are actually caused by a bacterial infection that infects these gastric pores that we talked about on this slide and prevents them from producing mucosa that would protect the lining of the stomach from all the acid. So you get this bacterial infection, you stop producing mucus, then your gastric juices start eating through the lining of your stomach. And if it eats all the way through, then you have those gastric juices leaching into your abdominal cavity, which is really bad. Then, so that's how these two are closely tied together. Then we can talk about roundworms. Roundworms are the parasite I like to talk about the stomach because although they don't usually infect the stomach, we often find them in the stomachs of cats. So that's why I bring them up now. The one we will be finding in the cat is called Toxocara cati. And the two stages that you see on this page are the egg and the larval stages, which are both microscopic, so we probably won't see those. Talking a little bit about the life cycle of Toxocara cati is very similar to what we saw with Toxoplasma gondii, which is where you have a transport host with larvae and eggs. It gets consumed by the cat. Those encysted in the cat's feces. And then we have the larvae developing inside of the egg, inside of the cat. And that's where I'll stop. I ran out of time. I'll pick it up